hormone. One basic but very important takeaway that you'll learn about today, which was news to me, is that it's not just the duration and depth of your sleep that matter, but actually getting to sleep at relatively the same time each night ensures that you get adequate growth hormone release in the first hours of sleep. In fact, if you require, let's say, 8 hours of sleep per night, but you go to sleep 2 hours later than your typical bedtime on any given night, you actually miss the window for growth hormone release. That's right. Getting growth hormone release in sleep, which is absolutely critical to our immediate and long-term health, is not a prerequisite of getting sleep, even if we are getting enough sleep. As Dr. Poe explains, there are critical brain circuits and endocrine, that is hormone circuits, that regulate not just the duration and depth and quality and timing of sleep, but when we place our bout of sleep, that is when we go to sleep each night, plus or minus about a half hour or so, strongly dictates whether or not we will experience all the health-promoting, including mind-promoting benefits of sleep.
There is some evidence that the first 4 hours of sleep are very important for memory processing. And in fact, if you've learned something new that day or have experienced a new sensory motor experience, then your early sleep dreams will incorporate that experience much more than the later sleep dreams. Later, as that memory gets consolidated from the early structures, which are the hippocampus deep in the temporal lobe, to the cortex in a distributed fashion, that memory seems to move from that hippocampus to the cortex, and also the dreams that incorporate that memory also move later in the night. So nobody knows why, but it does. There was a great study by Siddhartha Ribeiro who studied the consolidation of memories from the cortex, from the hippocampus to the cortex in a rat across the period of a full day's sleep, because rats sleep in the daytime. And he found that each subsequent REM sleep period moved that memory from the hippocampus to the first area that projects to it, and then the second area, and then the third area. And you can see the memory moving throughout the sleep period. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So I have to read that study. Yeah. So there's a number of different hormones associated with the different stages of sleep. We know that melatonin is a hormone
of nighttime
that makes us sleepy. What about growth hormone release? When does that occur during sleep?
So growth hormone release happens all day long and all night long, but the deep slow wave sleep that you get the very first sleep cycle is when you get a big bolus of growth hormone release, and in men and women equally. And if you miss that first deep slow wave sleep period, you also miss that big bolus of growth hormone release. And you might get ultimately across the day just as much overall growth hormone release, but endocrinologists will tell you that big boluses do different things than a little bit eked out over time. So that is when we know there's also a big push to synthesize proteins. So that's when the protein synthesis part that builds memories, for example, in our brain happens in that first cycle of sleep. So you don't want to miss that, especially if you've learned something really big and needs more synaptic space to encode it.
How would somebody miss that first 90 minutes?
Depriving themselves. Yeah. So
let's say I normally go to sleep at 10 p.m. And then from 10 to 11:30 would be this first phase of sleep, and that's when the big bolus of growth hormone would be released. Does that mean that if I go to sleep instead at 11:30 or midnight that I miss that first phase of sleep?
Yeah.
Why is it not the case that I get that first phase of sleep just simply starting later?
It is a beautiful clock that we have in our body that knows when things should happen. And it's every cell in our body has a clock, and all of those clocks are normally synchronized, and those circadian clocks are synchronized. And so our cells are ready to respond to that growth hormone release at a particular time. And if we miss it, and it's a time in relation to melatonin also, so if you miss it, yeah, you might get some growth hormone release, but it's occurring at a time when your clock has already moved to the next phase. And so it's just a clock thing.
Yeah, I don't think we can overstate the importance of what you just described. And to be honest, despite knowing a bit about the sleep research and circadian biology, this is the very first time that I've ever heard this, that if you normally go to sleep at a particular time, and growth hormone is released in that first phase of sleep, that you can't simply initiate your sleep bout later and expect to capture that first phase of sleep.
Yeah.
That's incredible and I think important. And as many listeners are probably realizing, also highly actionable. So what this means is that we should have fairly consistent bedtimes in addition to fairly consistent wake times.
Yes,
is that right?
Exactly. And in fact, one of the best markers of good neurological health when we get older is consistent bedtimes.
Wow. Okay. I don't want to backtrack, but I did write down something that I think is important for me to resolve, or for you to resolve. So I'm going to ask this, people that sleep 9 hours or more, perhaps that reflecting an issue, some underlying issue, perhaps, is being a teenager or an adolescent and undergoing a stage of development where there's a lot of bodily and brain growth, an exception to that? Because I don't recall sleeping a ton when I was a teenager. I had a ton of energy, but I know a few teenagers and they sleep a lot. They'll just sleep and sleep and sleep and sleep. Should we let them sleep and sleep and sleep? Okay.
Let them sleep.
Okay, so that's the one exception. What about
just like babies?
Okay.
When you're developing something in your brain or the rest of your body, you really need sleep to help organize that. I mean, sleep is doing really hard work in organizing our brains and making it develop right. And if we deprive ourselves of sleep, we will actually also, just like I said, we have a daily clock. We also have a developmental clock, and we can miss a developmental window if we don't let ourselves sleep extra like we need to.
What other things inhibit growth hormone release or other components of this first stage of sleep? In other words, if I go to sleep religiously every night at 10 p.m., are there things that I perhaps do in the preceding hours of the preceding day, like ingest caffeine or alcohol, that can make that first stage of sleep less effective, even if I'm going to sleep at the same time?
Alcohol definitely will do that, because alcohol is a REM sleep suppressant, and it even suppresses some of that stage 2 transition to REM with those sleep spindles. And those sleep spindles, we didn't talk about their function yet, but they're really important for moving memories to our cortex. It's a unique time when our hippocampus, the sort of like the RAM of our brains, writes it to a hard disk, and which is the cortex. And it's a unique time when they're connected. So if you don't want to miss that, you don't want to miss REM sleep, when is also a part of the consolidation process and schema changing process. And alcohol in there, before we go to sleep, we'll do that. Until we've metabolized alcohol and put it out of our bodies, it will affect our sleep badly. So
probably fair to say no ingestion of alcohol within the 4 to 6 hours preceding sleep, given the half-life. Or at all would be better, but I know some people refuse to go that way.
Maybe a little bit is okay. I don't know what the dose response is, but there are studies out there you can look at.
Great. Yeah. So we're still in the first stage of sleep, and I apologize for slowing us down, but it sounds like it's an incredibly important first phase of sleep. Yeah. What about the second and third 90-minute blocks of sleep? Is there anything that makes those unique? What is their signature besides the fact that they come second and third in the night?
There's more and more REM sleep the later the night we get. There's also a change in hormones. The growth hormone and melatonin levels are starting to decline, but other hormones are picking up. So it is a really different stage that you also don't want to shortchange yourself on. And I think that's the stage. Many studies are showing that those are the times in sleep when the most creativity can happen. That's when our dreams can incorporate and put together old and new things together into a new way. And our schema are built during that time. So, we can change our minds best during those phases of sleep.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on schema? I don't think anyone on this podcast has ever discussed schema. I'm a little bit familiar with schema from my courses on psychology, but it's been a while. So maybe if you could just refresh mine and everyone else's memory.
Well, it's still a concept.
Sure.
Schema.
Well, how do you define schema?
Right. I think of schema as like we have a schema of Christmas, right? We have all kinds of ideas that we sew together and call Christmas, a holiday season. In the Northern Hemisphere, it's cold. We have Santa Claus and reindeer and jingle bells and even things that are false, but we normally associate with Christmas presents, family gathering, when it is. All of this stuff is sewn together into one. There's a thread linking them all, and we can just give ourselves a list of words, and none of them contain the word Christmas, and then ask people later,
You just did.
Yeah.
Noted. So as people start to approach morning or the time when they normally would wake up, I've heard that it's important to, if possible, complete one of these 90-minute cycles prior to waking up. That is, if you set your alarm for halfway through one of these 90-minute cycles that come late in the night, the locus ceruleus, a difficult structure to spell, but a beautifully named structure. I find locus ceruleus to be just fascinating, and I know a small fraction of what it does, and I'm hoping you're going to educate me and our audience about what it does, and hopefully tell us a little bit about its relationship to epinephrine, aka adrenaline.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up because I can totally geek out on the locus ceruleus.
Please do.
Locus meaning spot or place, and ceruleus meaning blue, so you could just call it the blue spot. That's the easiest. Every animal with a brain has a blue spot, and and I mean every other animal with a brain because, of course, there are animals with nervous systems that are not centralized, like jellyfish. But anyway, we're digressing there. So the locus ceruleus is filled with neurons that have in them norepinephrine, which is the brain's version of epinephrine or adrenaline. It's also called noradrenaline. And what it does is it, just like adrenaline in the rest of our bodies, it helps prime us to respond to our environment. So when locus ceruleus neurons fire in a burst, we can switch our attention, and they will fire in a burst if, for example, a loud noise happens in the middle of your concentrating on something. So it fires, and it helps you switch your attention to that thing and then learn quickly from it. So it's really important in a stress response. It helps us do quick one-trial learning. And then a tonic activity during the day when you're just going about your normal concentration kind of activities is really good for sustained attention. It works with the cholinergic system of our basal forebrain, which is really important for learning and memory also, to help us learn about things and put things together. But just tonic levels are signature of wakefulness and alertness. So too much is panic with the locus ceruleus activity. A burst is switching attention, and then tonic levels are sustained, constant attention. And then when we go to sleep, the locus ceruleus slows and goes from about, on average, 2 hertz to about 1 hertz, 1 cycle per second, tonically. And then when we go into REM sleep, it's the only time when it shuts off completely. And it appears that complete silence is really, really important for a number of things. And the main thing that I think it's important for is the ability to erase and break down synapses that are no longer working for us. So they encode things that are false now, or they are encoding things that we learned in the novelty encoding pathway of our brain that have now been consolidated to other pathways, and so we need to now erase them from the novelty encoding pathway. And that is really, really important for being able to continue to learn things all of our lives. So like erasing that RAM or that, I don't know, what do you call those discs that you stick into computers?
Hard drive. Thumb drives.
Thumb drives, yeah. You're erasing your thumb drive. So that thumb drive is what you carry around all day long. And then during sleep, you write that thumb drive to the cortex, to the long-term memory structures, and you need to refresh that thumb drive. And that's what happens during REM sleep when the locus ceruleus is off, because whenever it's on and noradrenaline is there, it helps us to put things together. It helps us to learn and strengthen synapses, but it does not allow us to actually weaken synapses that are also a really important part for important part of lifelong learning. There's so much more I could say about that.
Yeah, locus ceruleus sounds fascinating. So it's connected to the basal forebrain cholinergic system. The neurons in locus ceruleus, if I'm not mistaken, release norepinephrine, perhaps epinephrine as well.
Well, no, the brain's version of epinephrine is norepinephrine.
Right.
The other thing, the precursor to norepinephrine is dopamine. And so the source of dopamine in the hippocampus seems to be the locus coeruleus, and it's still a mystery as under what conditions the locus coeruleus also releases dopamine, but it's really important when we're learning something new to also release dopamine or to at least activate the dopaminergic receptors in our hippocampus. So dopamine, norepinephrine, and then there's also galanin, which is important for releasing when we're stressed, and it helps also with that rapid learning. It works in concert with norepinephrine and in doing what it needs to do to strengthen synapses so that we learn really quickly.
I love that there are multiple molecules involved, because that signals us to a principle, which is that even if people can't remember all the names, that rarely in biology is something handled by just one molecular pathway, that
That's
redundancy is the rule,
Yeah.
because signaling attention to specific events is so important.
That's
so that
right.
I'm going to use that as a just so story. I
Yeah.
always say, I wasn't consulted at the design phase, but it makes sense to me as to why redundancy would exist in the system.
Absolutely. And in fact, when we form hypotheses about the brain, we're always wrong. And the reason why we're always wrong is because it's more complicated than we'd like to think. And because in our brains, when we're forming hypotheses, we fail to account for all of the factors that are involved, the glia, the neuropeptides, the neurotransmitters, the physical structure of synapses. And so when I was going through grad school 35 years ago, the dogma was that every neuron contains one neurotransmitter and releases one neurotransmitter. And you had excitatory neurotransmitters and inhibitory neurotransmitters and neuromodulatory neurotransmitters, but that's as complicated as it got. And then we started talking about neuropeptides, and people said, oh no, please don't complicate it. And then we started talking about how neurons contain both neuropeptides and neurotransmitters, and maybe more than one neurotransmitter.
And maybe even hormones too.
And hormones, and oh Lord, it's just so complicated. But I mean, got to admit, that's why it works, right? And every time the brain teaches us something new about itself that we didn't hypothesize, we say, oh, of course, that wouldn't work if the way I hypothesized it with it. We actually need redundancy. We need all of these systems to work together.
Yeah, it's daunting sometimes, but it also ensures many careers in science and neuroscience in particular. So note that aspiring scientists, there's plenty of room for discovery.
Do you want me to talk about norepinephrine and emotion?
What I'd love for you to tell us about is, what role this lack of norepinephrine release during rapid eye movement sleep is thought to achieve. And maybe you could also review some of your work describing conditions under which norepinephrine invades
sleep,
rapid eye movement sleep, and other patterns of sleep, and how that can be detrimental.
Yeah. So a lot of this is hypothetical, but based on a lot of good evidence that we're sewing together into a schema from which these hypotheses come. So a model schema from which these hypotheses come. But one thing that happens to people with post-traumatic stress disorder is that there is a lot of evidence that the locus coeruleus doesn't stop firing in REM sleep. So whereas their levels of norepinephrine might be similar to people without PTSD during the day and even during the first part of the night, during the wee hours of the morning, and when you measure norepinephrine levels from metabolites in the blood or the cerebral spinal fluid, you see that people with PTSD, it's during the wee hours of the morning when you have the most REM sleep that their norepinephrine levels differentiate most from those that don't have PTSD. And so that's evidence that the locus coeruleus is not shutting down during REM sleep like it should. Other evidence is heart rate variability. When our locus coeruleus is firing, our heart rates are generally a little higher, and they don't vary as much as they do when the locus coeruleus is not firing. So during slow wave sleep, normally have this big juicy variability in heart rate with every breath in and breath out, because our noradrenergic levels, our norepinephrine levels are lower. During REM sleep, that goes away entirely, and our heart rate is dominated by parasympathetic rather than sympathetic activity, and also what our brain is driving, what we're dreaming about. For example, if we're dreaming we're running, our heart rates will go up. But norepinephrine levels still should be low or off. So people with PTSD, that noradrenergics, we're studying these in rats too. Is it true that our locus coeruleus doesn't shut off when we have post-traumatic stress disorder? And the preliminary evidence is, yes, it's true that it doesn't shut off. So what that would do is norepinephrine would act at synapses to prevent that weakening that you really need, for example, of novelty encoding structures. And it keeps memories in that novelty encoding structure, even once it's consolidated to the rest of the brain. So in the hippocampus, which is important for remembering things throughout our lives, and it's that thumb drive, we need it to be erased so that we can learn new things once it's been consolidated to the hard drive of our cortex. And so if we're not able to do that, we fill up that RAM really quickly, or that thumb drive really quickly, and we're not able to learn new things. So, and this is, again, preliminary data that we don't have all the answers yet, and we are looking into it actively right now, but it's really important. The other thing about women is that we are 2 to 4 times more susceptible to anxiety-related mental health disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder. So if we could figure out what's happening to the locus coeruleus during sleep in women, and then figure out a way to normalize that so the locus coeruleus is silent when it needs to be silent, I think we could go a long way in helping women be more resilient to stress-related disorders.
What are some other sex differences as they relate to sleep?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There have been very few studies, unfortunately, of women in sleep, women an estrous cycle or menstrual cycle in sleep. And but what we have found, which actually largely replicated a study in 1960, is that women, or females rather, at high estrogen, high hormonal phases of their estrous cycle or menstrual cycle sleep a lot less, but that sleep is more efficient. So that sleep is more dense in those sleep spindles, which I haven't gone into what they might do, except this connection between the hippocampus and cortex. But those sleep spindles are more dense and more coherent across the brain areas. The theta cycle, which is 5 to 10 hertz in the hippocampus, important for one-year learning and also important during REM sleep, is also bigger and juicier during the high hormonal phases. So even though there's less sleep, it's more efficient and better. So all of that efficiency seems to be reduced in those other hormonal phases. So even though you might sleep a little more, you might need more sleep, in fact, in order to accomplish the same thing that you can get with that short, very efficient sleep of high hormonal phases.
Very interesting. I think there's a growing trend, at least among NIH-funded grants, to require that, as they refer to it in the grants, biological sex as a variable.
Yes.
Here we're not talking about sex, the verb, although I'm sure there's studies about that too, but biological sex is a variable because there is a dearth of studies exploring sex differences in most everything.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of reasons for that, but more importantly, fortunately, the trend is shifting.
Yeah. And even when you study males versus females, a lot of people just include females in their studies, but then don't track the estrous cycle or menstrual cycle. And hormones have huge effects on our behavior. I mean, just think about when you said sex, before our hormones come in, we're not interested in it. And suddenly, that's kind of a main driver of our behaviors. Hormones can definitely change who we are and what we do. So we should be studying hormones, not just sex. I
always say that puberty is perhaps the most massive transformation and rate of aging that any of us go through in a short amount of time. An individual, their cognition changes, their worldview changes, and that's largely hormonal driven, and obviously neural architectures change too. I'm very happy that you mentioned trying to get into calmer states prior to sleep and some ways to do that. I'm a big fan, and I've talked a lot before on this podcast about things like yoga nidra, which is a non-movement based practice, sometimes called non-sleep deep rest, where people actually take some time each day to practice how to go into a more parasympathetic, aka relaxed state deliberately, because it's a bit of a skill.
Yeah.
It's and there's some good data, really, mostly out of a laboratory in Scandinavia, showing huge increases in nigrostriatal dopamine when people go basically engage in a practice of deliberate non-movement, and that the brain actually enters states of a very shallow sleep. So it's sort of nap-ish, but the idea is to actually stay awake but motionless. And it does seem to restore a certain number of features of neurochemistry, but perhaps more importantly, it teaches people to relax, which is something that most people are not very good at.
Yeah.
But in any event, and people who listen to this podcast have heard me say this over and over again, so I sound like a broken record, but this practice as a zero-cost practice that doesn't require any pharmacology does seem to really enhance people's ability to fall asleep more quickly and to fall back asleep if they wake up in the middle of the night. So